Look at this photograph from Chicago, 1871. Notice anything strange? Entire city blocks of ornate buildings, each one a masterpiece of architectural engineering, standing proud with their columned facades and intricate stonework. Now look at this photograph from the exact same location, 1872. Gone. All of it. Vanished. The official story? The Great Chicago Fire destroyed everything. But here's what they don't tell you. Those buildings weren't made of wood. They were limestone, marble, granite. Massive stone structures with walls 3 feet thick. The fire lasted less than 2 days. 2 days. And somehow it completely erased stone buildings that should have stood for centuries. Does that make any sense to you? Because it shouldn't. Fire doesn't vaporize stone. It doesn't erase foundations. It doesn't make entire districts disappear without leaving rubble, without leaving basement levels, without leaving any archaeological evidence whatsoever. But that's exactly what happened. Not just in Chicago. San Francisco, 1906, Boston, 1872, New York multiple times, London, 1666, Moscow, 1812, Tokyo, 1923. Every major city on Earth has the same story: catastrophic fire, complete destruction, immediate rebuilding, and in every single case, the buildings that vanished were far more sophisticated than what replaced them. Let me show you something that will break your understanding of history. In the basement archives of the New York Public Library, there are city planning documents from 1870. These documents show detailed demolition records for every single building torn down in Manhattan between 1850 and 1870. Every single one. Names of contractors, dates of demolition, disposal locations for materials, costs, permits, everything meticulously recorded. Now look at the records from 1871 to 1890. During this period, according to photographs, roughly 60% of Manhattan's buildings were replaced. 60%. Thousands of structures. Massive granite edifices, some of them 8 stories tall with foundations that went down 30 feet. And the demolition records. They don't exist. Not incomplete. Not poorly maintained. They simply don't exist. As if thousands of buildings just vanished into thin air and new ones appeared in their place. The official explanation? The records were lost in various fires. How convenient. The demolition records for the demolished buildings were destroyed by the fires that necessitated the demolitions that weren't recorded because the records were destroyed. Do you see the circular logic? Do you see how this makes absolutely no sense? But it gets stranger, much stranger. Those old buildings, the ones in the photographs from before the fires, look at them closely. Really look. The level of craftsmanship is extraordinary. We're talking about an era that supposedly had no electric tools, no modern mathematics, no computer-aided design, no laser levels. They had hammers and chisels and rope. That's it. And yet they created buildings with perfect symmetry, with columns that align within millimeters across hundreds of feet, with decorative elements repeated with such precision that modern architects using CAD software struggle to match it. Each window frame, a work of art. Each cornice perfectly proportioned, each facade balanced with mathematical precision. They supposedly built hundreds of these structures simultaneously in cities across the world during the same narrow time period, the 1850s through 1870s. A global building boom of unprecedented scale and sophistication. And then, conveniently, most of them burned down within a single generation. And the buildings that replaced them? Simpler, cruder, less sophisticated in every measurable way. We are told that human civilization progresses linearly, that we get better with time, that each generation surpasses the last. But the physical evidence shows the exact opposite. The buildings got worse, the craftsmanship declined, the ambition shrank. Does that sound like progress to you? Here's another impossibility. The World's Fairs. The Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. The official story says they built over 200 buildings covering more than 600 acres in less than 2 years. Massive neoclassical structures with domed roofs, columned halls, intricate plasterwork, statuary, fountains, canals. They called it the White City. Photographs show it was spectacular, buildings that looked like they belonged in ancient Rome. And then, 1 year after the fair ended, they demolished all of it. Every single building. Gone. The official reason? They were temporary structures made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber. Temporary. Does this look temporary to you? Look at the foundations in the photographs. Look at the scale. Look at the infrastructure. Electrical systems, water systems, sewage systems for a temporary city housing 27 million visitors. They built it in 2 years and destroyed it in 1. The Paris Exposition of 1889. Demolished. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo 1901. Demolished. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis 1904. Demolished. Every single World's Fair followed the same pattern.
Extraordinary buildings appear. Millions visit. Everything gets destroyed. And in most cases destroyed by fire. Convenient fires. Fires that left no trace. Fires that somehow consumed stone and steel and left nothing behind. But here's what really doesn't make sense. Look at photographs of these World's Fair buildings under construction. You won't find many. Almost none, actually. They show the finished buildings. They show crowds walking through completed structures. But the construction process, nearly invisible in the photographic record. For the Columbian Exposition, one of the most photographed events of the 19th century, there are thousands of images of the completed fair, and less than a dozen showing actual construction. How does that happen? They supposedly had hundreds of photographers documenting this monumental achievement, and almost none of them photographed the construction. The few construction images that do exist show something interesting. Crews of workers, but not doing construction. They're doing excavation, digging, uncovering. In several images, you can clearly see buildings that appear to be emerging from the ground rather than being built upward. Staircases that descend into earth, foundations that go down multiple levels, basement windows below ground level. These aren't buildings being constructed, they're buildings being unearthed. Let's talk about those basement windows. Walk through any major city built before 1900, and you'll see them everywhere. Windows at sidewalk level. Windows below sidewalk level. Windows that serve no purpose because they're half buried in earth or completely underground. The official explanation? The street level was raised over time. Fine. Reasonable. Except when you look at the scale. In some cities, the street level is 10, 12, even 15 feet higher than the original ground floor. That's an entire story buried. In Chicago, there are buildings where the original first floor is now the basement, and the original basement is 2 stories underground. When did they raise the street? How did they raise it? Where did they get enough material to raise the street level of an entire city by 15 feet? The official story says they did it slowly, over decades, bringing in fill dirt. Except the photographs don't show this gradual process. Photographs from 1870 show street level at 1 height. Photographs from 1875 show it 15 feet higher, 5 years. They supposedly raised the entire street level of cities like Chicago, Seattle, and San Francisco by up to 20 feet in less than a decade. Do you have any idea how much material that is? Millions of tons of earth. Where did it come from? Who paid for it? Where are the records of this massive undertaking? They don't exist. Here's another pattern that appears everywhere. Orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 orphan children were transported from eastern cities to the American Midwest and West. 250,000 children. Orphans. Where did they come from? The official story varies depending on the source. Immigration, urban poverty, disease, parents who couldn't afford to keep them. But here's the problem with that explanation. The numbers don't match.
Population records from cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia don't show the demographic collapse necessary to produce 250,000 orphans in a 75-year period. And it's not just America. London had the same phenomenon. Paris, Moscow, Berlin. Every major city in the Western world experienced a mysterious surge of orphaned children in the mid to late 1800s. Children with no parents, no records, no known family history.
Just thousands upon thousands of children appearing in orphanages with no clear origin. And they were sent out on trains to repopulate areas that were, according to official records, already populated. Settlers were already there. Communities were already established. So why did they need trainloads of orphaned children? Look at photographs of American frontier towns from the 1860s and 1870s. These are supposedly brand new settlements, freshly built by pioneers. Except the buildings don't look new. They look old, weathered. The brick is aged. The foundations are settled. The infrastructure is already in place. Street lamps, paved roads, water systems. In photographs from 1870, you can see towns in Kansas and Nebraska with 3-story brick buildings, ornate facades, established commercial districts. The official timeline says these towns were founded 5, maybe 10 years earlier. That means they went from empty prairie to sophisticated urban centers in less than a decade. Using what resources? What labor force? What expertise? Pioneers in covered wagons built 3-story brick buildings with decorative cornices and indoor plumbing. Does that make any sense? Or is it more logical to conclude that these buildings were already there? That these towns were already established, and that the pioneers didn't build them, but rather moved into them? Now let's talk about the technology that was lost. Specifically, atmospheric electricity. If you look at old buildings, really look at them, you'll notice something strange. Metal spires everywhere, ornate metal roof decorations, metal fence posts with specific geometric patterns, metal sculptures on building tops. The official explanation calls them decorative, aesthetic choices. But what if they weren't decorative at all? What if they were functional? What if they were part of an electrical system that harvested energy from the atmosphere? Sound crazy? Look at the buildings. Look at how the metal elements are arranged. Look at how they're grounded. Look at how they connect to metal frameworks within the building structure. This isn't random decoration. This is systematic, intentional, engineered. And it's everywhere. Every old building has it. The metal ornaments, the spires, the specific placements, all positioned to capture something, to channel something. Now look at when these elements started disappearing. Early 1900s. Right after Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was shut down. Right after his experiments with wireless electricity transmission were suppressed. Right after the power companies established their monopoly on electrical distribution. Coincidence? Or evidence of a technology that was deliberately erased? Here's what really happened. The part they don't want you to know. Those old buildings, the sophisticated ones, the ones with the impossible craftsmanship and the unexplainable technology, they weren't built in the 1800s. They couldn't have been. The technology didn't exist. The labor force didn't exist. The expertise didn't exist. Those buildings were already there. They were remnants of a previous civilization, a previous age, a previous world that was far more advanced than ours. And something happened. Something catastrophic. Something that erased most of the population and left the infrastructure intact. The survivors, our ancestors, moved into these buildings. They occupied them. They used them. But they didn't understand them. They didn't know how the electrical systems worked. They didn't know how the heating systems operated. They didn't know how the water systems functioned. So they improvised. They adapted. They created inferior systems to replace the ones they couldn't comprehend. And over time, as the old systems failed, as the old buildings decayed, they replaced them with simpler structures built to their limited understanding. The fires weren't accidents. They were erasures. They were deliberate destructions of evidence. Think about it logically. If you wanted to hide the existence of a previous civilization, if you wanted to rewrite history, if you wanted to establish a new narrative of human progress, what would you do? You'd destroy the evidence. You'd burn the old buildings. You'd demolish the remnants. You'd bury the foundations. You'd rewrite the records. And that's exactly what we see. Systematic fires, cities burning, always the old districts, always the sophisticated buildings, always leaving no archaeological evidence, and always followed by immediate rebuilding with inferior structures. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. This was coordinated. This was global. Look at the world's fairs through this lens, and everything makes sense. They weren't building temporary structures. They were uncovering existing structures. They were excavating old-world buildings, cleaning them, restoring them, and presenting them as new construction. That's why there are so few construction photographs. Because there was no construction. There was excavation, restoration, adaptation. And then, after millions of people saw these buildings, after millions of people witnessed the sophistication of the old-world architecture, they had to destroy the evidence. They couldn't let these buildings stand. They couldn't let people compare them to the new, inferior construction. So they burned them. They demolished them. They claimed it was all temporary, all made of plaster, all disposable. But the foundations remain. Go to the sites of the old world's fairs and dig. You'll find them. Stone foundations, metal frameworks, infrastructure that goes down multiple levels, evidence of buildings far more permanent than the official story admits. The mud flood theory explains all of this. At some point in the relatively recent past, possibly the early 1800s, a global catastrophe occurred. Flooding, ashfall, rapid geological change, something that buried entire cities under multiple feet of mud and sediment. The survivors found themselves in a world transformed. Buildings buried to their second stories, basements flooded and filled with sediment, infrastructure damaged beyond repair, and a vastly reduced population. That's where the orphans came from. They weren't orphans from poverty or disease. They were the survivors, children who lost their families in the catastrophe. And they were distributed to repopulate areas that had been depopulated by whatever happened. The old photographs show this clearly. Cities in the 1850s and 1860s look empty. Streets are wide and vacant. Buildings stand, but few people occupy them. It's not until the 1880s and 1890s that the population density starts to match what we'd expect. Because that's when the repopulation was complete. That's when the survivors and their children had rebuilt enough of society to function normally. But they couldn't rebuild to the same level. They didn't have the knowledge. They didn't have the technology. They were primitive people living in sophisticated structures they didn't build and couldn't maintain. So the buildings decayed, the systems failed, and eventually, those in power made a decision. Rather than admit they were living in the ruins of a greater civilization, rather than acknowledge their own technological inferiority, they rewrote history. They created a narrative of linear progress. They backdated the buildings, claiming they were built recently. They created construction records for buildings that were never constructed. They invented timelines that made no sense but supported the narrative. And they systematically destroyed anything that contradicted the new official story. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for. Take the Smithsonian Institution, founded in 1846, officially to increase and diffuse knowledge. Noble mission. Except there's a pattern. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Smithsonian was involved in hundreds of archaeological expeditions across North America. They excavated thousands of burial mounds. They discovered thousands of artifacts, giant skeletons, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated tools that shouldn't exist according to the official timeline. And what happened to these discoveries? They vanished, disappeared into the Smithsonian's warehouses, never to be seen again. Researchers who ask about them are told the artifacts were lost, misplaced, or never existed in the first place. Newspaper articles from the 1800s describe these discoveries in detail. Giant human skeletons, some over 8 feet tall, found in burial mounds across Ohio, Tennessee, Arizona, Nevada. Dozens of reports, multiple witnesses, professional excavations, and then nothing. The Smithsonian denies it all, claims the newspapers were exaggerating, claims the measurements were wrong, claims it never happened. But the newspaper archives don't lie. The reports are there, consistent, detailed, describing anatomical features, burial practices, associated artifacts. These weren't hoaxes. These were systematic discoveries of evidence that contradicted the approved narrative of human history. And it's not just America. In Europe, the same pattern. Ancient texts disappearing from libraries. Archaeological sites suddenly declared off-limits. Artifacts reclassified or hidden away. The Vatican Library, one of the most extensive collections of ancient documents in the world, is closed to independent researchers. You need special permission, granted rarely and only for specific approved topics. What are they hiding? What's in those archives that can't be made public? Historical records that contradict the official timeline? Maps showing continents that supposedly weren't discovered yet? Technical documents describing technologies that supposedly didn't exist? We know they have ancient star charts. We know they have pre-Columbian maps of America. We know they have texts describing advanced mathematics and engineering from eras we're told were primitive. But we're not allowed to see them. We're not allowed to study them. We're told to trust the approved narrative and stop asking questions. Look at the Great Fires through this lens and a pattern emerges. London, 1666. The Great Fire destroys 13,200 houses and 87 churches. Convenient. Moscow, 1812. Fire destroys 3/4 of the city right as Napoleon arrives. Convenient. Chicago, 1871. Fire destroys the entire central city. San Francisco, 1906. Fire following the earthquake destroys more of the city than the earthquake itself. In every case, the fires specifically target the old world architecture, the sophisticated buildings, the ones with the impossible craftsmanship, the ones that don't fit the narrative. And in every case, the fires are attributed to accidents: a bakery in London, a dropped lantern in Chicago, earthquake damage in San Francisco. But the pattern is too consistent, too systematic, too perfectly timed. These weren't accidents. These were operations, coordinated destructions of evidence. And after each fire, the same thing happens: immediate rebuilding, but not by the original methods, not with the original sophistication. The new buildings are simpler, more utilitarian, less ornate. We're told this is modernization, progress, evolution of architectural style. But look at what was lost: the intricate stone carvings, the perfectly proportioned facades, the harmonious integration of form and function. The new buildings don't have that. They can't achieve it, because the knowledge of how to create it was lost with the buildings that burned. The craftsmen who could work stone with millimeter precision, gone. The engineers who could design structures that stood for centuries without modern materials, gone. The architects who understood sacred geometry and harmonic proportions, gone. What replaced them? Mass production, standardization, simplification. We call it progress, but the buildings themselves tell a different story. Now let's talk about the doors. This is something you can verify yourself. Go to any old building constructed before 1900. Look at the main entrance doors. Notice how tall they are? 12 feet, 14 feet, sometimes 16 feet high. For a door. The official explanation is aesthetic. Grand entrances for grand buildings. Fine. Except look at the interior doors. Look at the hallway doors, the room doors, the doors that the public never sees. They're the same height. 12 feet, 14 feet, doors that open into storage rooms, doors that open into maintenance corridors, doors in the basement, all impossibly tall for normal human use. A 6-foot-tall person looks tiny next to these doors. You need a ladder to reach the top hinge. Why would anyone design interior service doors to be 14 feet tall? Unless they weren't designed for people of normal height. Unless the original occupants were taller. Much taller. The same pattern appears in the ceilings. 20-foot ceilings in residential buildings. 25-foot ceilings in public buildings. We're told this was for air circulation, for grandeur, for acoustic properties. But residential bedrooms don't need 20-foot ceilings for any of those reasons. Heating a room with a 20-foot ceiling in the era before central heating would be impossibly expensive and inefficient. It makes no sense, unless the people who originally occupied these rooms were proportionally scaled to the ceiling height, unless they were 10, 12, 14 feet tall. And before you dismiss this as insane, remember the newspaper reports. Remember the giant skeletons found in burial mounds. Remember the Smithsonian's systematic suppression of this evidence. The buildings and the suppressed archaeological evidence tell the same story. There were giants. They built these structures, and something happened to them. Look at the staircases. This is another detail hiding in plain sight. In old buildings, the staircases are wrong. The steps are too deep. Each step is 16, 18, sometimes 20 inches deep. Standard modern steps are 10 to 11 inches deep because that matches average human stride length. But these old stairs require you to take exaggerated steps, almost like climbing. Why would builders intentionally create stairs that are uncomfortable for normal-sized people, unless they weren't building for normal-sized people? Walk up one of these staircases and pay attention to how it feels. Each step requires extra effort. Your gait is wrong. Your rhythm is off. Now imagine someone 12 feet tall walking up these same stairs. The proportions would be perfect. The depth would match their stride. The height would be comfortable. The staircases aren't wrong. We're just the wrong size for them. The windows tell the same story. In many old buildings, the first-floor windows are now at ground level or below. We're told the street was raised. But look at the windows themselves. Look at the size. 8 feet tall, 10 feet tall. Windows large enough that you could walk through them standing upright. The official explanation is natural light, ventilation, aesthetic appeal. But why would ground floor windows need to be 10 feet tall? That's a security nightmare. That's an insulation nightmare. That's an engineering challenge with no practical benefit. Unless the people looking out those windows were tall enough that 10-foot windows were proportionally normal. Unless they needed that height to comfortably see out without crouching. The architecture isn't designed for us. It's designed for someone else, someone bigger, and we've inherited their buildings without inheriting their size. Here's something else they don't want you to notice. The heating systems. Old buildings, especially those built in the 1800s, have heating systems that make no sense. You'll find ventilation shafts that are far too large for coal or wood heating. You'll find ductwork that doesn't connect to any visible furnace. You'll find rooms with heat registers, but no apparent heat source. Modern inspectors often can't figure out how these buildings were originally heated. The systems don't match any known technology from the era. Some buildings have what appear to be geothermal systems, tapping into ground heat through elaborate underground channels. Except geothermal heating wasn't invented until the 1940s. Some buildings have radiant floor heating with no visible mechanism for heating the floors. Some have air circulation systems that require electricity to function, except they were supposedly built before electrical systems existed. The only logical conclusion? These buildings had heating technology that we no longer understand. Technology that was lost. Technology that the new occupants couldn't maintain or replicate. The same applies to water systems. In cities across America, you'll find water towers on top of old buildings. Massive metal structures holding thousands of gallons of water. The official story is, they were needed for water pressure before modern pumping systems. Fine. Except the buildings they're sitting on were supposedly constructed in the 1860s and 1870s. The water towers are riveted steel construction, requiring industrial fabrication capabilities. How did builders in the 1860s, using hand tools and horse-drawn equipment, install multi-ton steel water towers on top of 8-story buildings? Where did they fabricate them? How did they lift them? How did they secure them? The official timeline makes no sense. But if these buildings were already standing, if they already had water systems in place, and if the new occupants needed to add supplemental water storage because they couldn't maintain the original systems, then the water towers make sense. They're not original to the buildings, they're retrofits, patches, evidence that the people who inherited these buildings didn't understand how they were supposed to function. Let's go back to the World's Fairs for a moment because there's another detail that doesn't add up. The Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. Official story says it cost $28 million to construct. In 1893 dollars, that's roughly $800 million in today's money, for temporary buildings that were demolished a year later. Does that make any financial sense? Would any rational organization spend $800 million on structures designed to be destroyed? The operating budget was separate, another $10 million. So $38 million total, over $1 billion in modern currency, for a one-year event. The official explanation is that it was worth it for the prestige, the tourism revenue, the international attention. Except the revenue from ticket sales was only $10 million. They lost money. Massively. And then they burned it all down, destroyed everything, melted down the metal, crushed the plaster, left nothing behind. Why? What were they hiding? Look at photographs of the Columbian Exposition under construction. I mentioned earlier there are very few. The ones that exist show something interesting. In the background of several images, you can see what appears to be excavation equipment. Steam shovels, crews digging, large piles of earth being removed. The official story says they were leveling the ground, preparing the site. But look at what they're removing. Sediment. Layers of mud and clay. And beneath it, you can see in some photographs, foundations, stone foundations, metal frameworks, structures that were already there, buried under mud, being uncovered and cleaned. The World's Fair wasn't built. It was excavated, restored, presented as new construction, and then destroyed to hide the evidence. This pattern repeats at every major World's Fair. Paris, 1889. The Eiffel Tower was supposedly built specifically for the exposition. Official timeline says it took 2 years to construct, except photographs from the construction period show something odd. The base of the tower, the massive stone and concrete foundation, appears weathered in the earliest photographs. Not new, not fresh concrete. Weathered, aged, as if it had been there far longer than 2 years. As if they built the metal superstructure on top of an existing foundation that was already ancient. And notice what happened after the fair. Most of the buildings were demolished, but the Eiffel Tower remained. Why? What made it different? Unless it wasn't really built for the fair. Unless it was already there, already functional, and they simply incorporated it into the exposition because they couldn't hide something that large and prominent. The same thing happened at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, 1901. Massive buildings, elaborate electrical systems. The entire fair was lit by electricity, over 400,000 light bulbs, powered by alternating current from Niagara Falls. This was 1901. Most American homes didn't have electricity yet. Most cities didn't have electrical infrastructure. But somehow they created a temporary city with complete electrical coverage for a 6-month event and then tore it all down. Does that make sense? Or is it more logical that the electrical infrastructure was already there, that they were utilizing existing systems from the old world, systems they didn't fully understand but could still operate? And then, 6 months into the exposition, President McKinley was assassinated while visiting the fair, shot twice by an anarchist. The fair never recovered. Attendance dropped. It closed early. And within a year, everything was demolished. Convenient timing. A president assassinated at a location showcasing old world technology, and then immediate destruction of all evidence. Here's something that will really disturb you. Population records. If you look at census data from the 1800s, the numbers don't make sense. Between 1810 and 1820, the population of the United States increased by 33%. Normal growth. Between 1820 and 1830, it increased by another 33%. Still reasonable. But then something strange happens. Between 1850 and 1860, right before the Civil War, the population increases by 35%. That's 8 million people added in 10 years. The official explanation is immigration. Millions of Europeans fleeing poverty and seeking opportunity in America. Fine. Except when you look at European population records from the same period, there's no corresponding population decrease. Europe's population was growing during this period, not shrinking. So where did 8 million people come from? They appear in the census records with no clear origin, and it gets stranger. During the Civil War 1861 to 1865, roughly 750,000 soldiers died. That's nearly 10% of the young male population. Catastrophic losses. You'd expect the population growth to slow or stop, but the 1870 census shows continued growth. Another 8 million people added, during and immediately after the most destructive war in American history. How? The same pattern appears in other countries. Russia's population records from the 1800s show impossible growth rates during periods of famine and war. China's records show massive population increases during the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that officially killed 20 to 30 million people. The numbers contradict themselves, unless the population records were fabricated, unless they were backdated, unless they were created to support a narrative of continuous growth and progress when the reality was population collapse and repopulation. The orphan trains make sense in this context. They weren't shipping orphans from overcrowded cities to empty frontier towns. They were redistributing survivors to repopulate areas that had been depopulated by the catastrophe, areas where entire communities had vanished, areas where buildings stood empty, waiting for new occupants. Look at photographs of these frontier towns again. The infrastructure is too sophisticated. The buildings are too refined. These aren't settlements built from scratch by pioneers. These are established communities being reoccupied, and the people moving in, the pioneers, the settlers, they're moving into buildings they didn't build, using roads they didn't construct, benefiting from water systems and sewage systems and electrical systems they didn't design. They're inheritors, not creators. And over time, as the old systems fail, as the old knowledge is lost, the infrastructure degrades, the buildings decay, the technology stops working, and they replace it with inferior substitutes because they don't understand how the original systems functioned. This is why old photographs look so strange. Why frontier towns in 1870 look more sophisticated than small towns in 1920. Why buildings from the 1860s are more ornate than buildings from the 1920s. Why craftsmanship declined over time instead of improving. Because we're not looking at progress, we're looking at decay. We're looking at a civilization living in the ruins of a greater one, slowly losing the remnants of old-world sophistication, gradually replacing it with simplified modern versions. The narrative of linear progress is a lie. The evidence shows regression, simplification, loss of knowledge, loss of capability, loss of understanding. And the fires keep happening. Throughout the early 1900s, mysterious fires destroy old-world buildings across the planet. The 1906 San Francisco fire destroys 80% of the city. The 1904 Baltimore fire destroys 1,500 buildings in the business district. The 1901 Jacksonville fire destroys 146 city blocks. All within a 5-year period. All attributed to accidents. All destroying primarily old-world architecture. And all followed by rapid rebuilding with modern, simplified structures. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Someone was systematically erasing the evidence. Someone wanted the old-world buildings gone. Someone wanted the technology hidden. Someone wanted the history rewritten. Who? That's the question nobody wants to answer. Who benefits from hiding human history? Who benefits from suppressing evidence of advanced ancient civilizations? Who benefits from maintaining a narrative of linear progress from primitive to modern? The answer is simple. Those in power. Those who control the present, control the past. If people knew that we're living in a diminished age, if people understood that our ancestors were more advanced than us, if people realized that knowledge and technology have been lost rather than gained, then the entire power structure collapses. The myth of inevitable progress dies. The belief in modern superiority evaporates, and people start asking dangerous questions. What happened? Where did the knowledge go? Who took it? Why? So the evidence gets destroyed, the buildings burn, the archives disappear, the artifacts vanish into museum basements, the photographs get misattributed, The timelines get rewritten. And anyone who questions the official narrative gets dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, a pseudoscientist, a fantasist. But the evidence doesn't care what you call it. The evidence exists. The buried first floors exist. The impossibly tall doors exist. The giant staircases exist. The sophisticated heating systems exist. The advanced water systems exist. The old photographs exist. The newspaper reports of giant skeletons exist. The systematic destruction of old-world architecture exists. All of it exists. All of it contradicts the official story. All of it points to the same conclusion. We are not the builders. We are the occupants. We are living in structures we didn't create, in cities we didn't plan, surrounded by infrastructure we barely understand. We are primitive people inhabiting the ruins of an advanced civilization, pretending we built it all ourselves, rewriting history to hide our own inadequacy. And every generation loses a little more. Every generation understands a little less. Every generation simplifies a little further. Until one day, nothing will remain of the old world except myths and legends, stories of giants and lost golden ages that everyone dismisses as fantasy. But the stones remember, the buildings remember, the foundations buried beneath our feet remember. And if you're willing to look, if you're willing to question, if you're willing to see what's been hidden in plain sight, you'll remember too. You'll see the truth. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are the survivors of its collapse. We are not the creators of this world. We are the inheritors of its ruins. And the greatest lie ever told is that we climbed to this point through progress, when the evidence screams that we fell to it through catastrophe.